This is Tim.
And this is Chris.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics, sponsored by ComicsNow.com. This week we have a special guest reviewer, Chris Schweizer. He teaches sequential art and animation at the Savannah College of Art and Design in Atlanta, and he's also cartoonist of the Krogan Adventure series from Oni Press, the first volume of which is called Krogan's March, which is now available in stores. So, how you doing, Chris?
I am doing really well. Actually, I'm currently working on Krogan's March, but Krogan's Vengeance is the one that is out now.
Okay.
And I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
Yeah, okay. Voice is a little screwed up, but whatever. I'm doing okay. The book we're reviewing today is Reading Comics, How Graphic Novels Work and What They Mean by Douglas Wolk. And yes, this is the book I was trashing during our Watchmen episode. I had some problems with especially the second half of it. The book is in two parts. Like, the first third is theory and history, and the second part is reviews and commentary. And for me, the theory and history section I don't have much problem with. I have some problem with the review section, but let's start talking about with the first part of it.
Okay. One of the things that I found to be really beneficial from this, there are a lot of things that I thought were really beneficial from this book, but one of the things that it did to me was help me understand the need for heavy continuity in Marvel and DC comics, something that I had heretofore sort of been railing against because I feel that it prevents new readership to the point that sort of younger readers are not coming in, and presumably the older readers will eventually die off, and those characters will sort of be left in limbo. And this book talked a lot about sort of the necessity of that for the market, and I thought that it did so in a way that makes me no longer, while I would love to see there be some sort of solution to bring in new readers, I can now sort of understand where that side of the argument is coming from in a way that I couldn't before.
Yeah, he's saying that it's kind of what they're selling, that kind of clubbiness, sort of. It appeals, the stories appeal to that, like, you know all this stuff, you have all this background, and here's more that fits into that.
Exactly, yeah. And I sort of, I can understand that. When I was in middle school, I think I got really big into the X-Men, as did everybody else in middle school that I knew. And it was sort of a lot of fun, like, learning who the characters were and how they were related to each other. And I would get all the Marvel cards in order to do that. I was never a big DC reader. Marvel is what really hooked me. And so I definitely bought into that a lot in my younger days. And so I can see the appeal, but I think that it has been sort of magnified over the past 10 years or so, to the point that there aren't as many sort of jump-in sections. For me, I had the Saturday morning Fox cartoon show for X-Men, and I think that for some readers, think the shows like or the films like Spider-Man or Iron Man are really good starting points. But I think that's one of the reasons why I never really got into the DC universe, is even though there were Batman movies and the animated series and things like that made me interested, there wasn't really a sort of a reader-friendly jump-in point for me for the DC comics. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I always sort of gravitated that way.
Yeah, well, I think Marvel, I don't know about DC, because I never read DC either myself. Partly I've just avoided it to try to keep my costs down.
Yeah.
But, Marvel, they used to have those little editorial footnotes that said, we're referring to something that happened in Fantastic Four 25 or something. And
exactly, yeah.
They don't do that anymore. It's made it that much more kind of impenetrable, unless you Google it, look it up on Wikipedia or something. So,
And yeah, I think that was something that I found was really interesting. There's definitely a lot of good stuff sort of throughout this first section of the book. I feel that up until this point, while there have been a lot of great sort of scholarly books about individual artists, stuff. I forget the name of the man who does most of the Karl Barks scholarship. He's at the University of Florida, and the University of Mississippi Press that puts out a lot of the conversation books and things like that. There's a lot of stuff sort of focused on the individual artists, but not a lot of English language sort of approaches to comics as an art form, and really giving it the sort of scholarly attention that things like film and painting and prose have gotten up until this point. Usually the critiques for what constitutes good and bad tend to not exist as much for comics. There's a lot of theory books and talking about how how comics work, and the McCloudian stuff and the Eisner stuff, but not a lot of books where that really take the audacity to define what constitutes good and bad, to basically set a standard for quality, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I think he's trying to do that with this one, and it's something that you do see in a lot of these other mediums, but I think comics haven't found it up until this point. And I think that's probably where it's going to receive the most criticism is in that back section. The front section, I think, does lead into that back section, which I didn't finish until you asked me to help review this. I just read the front section and sort of skimmed that back section because it was a little hard for me to take at first.
Yeah, I slogged through the back section a couple months ago. But yeah, I want to say some other things about the first section first. I liked the way that the book started out and going through those covers of different comics over the years and using them as sort of examples of how things have changed over time. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really strong. He points out, not just how the image was drawn, but also kind of the price and how the cover was kind of arranged, and like now we have the names of the creators on the front, which we didn't used to have.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really strong point.
It's also, I think, probably important to note that it seems as though Wolk builds his history on the idea that the graphic novel is sort of the peak, that this isn't a history of comics in relation to manga or necessarily even relation to how the floppy market operates. It seems to be this is how we've led to the graphic novel boom, is sort of the way that he seems to approach this history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it feels like even from the subtitle, how graphic novels work and what they mean, he's kind of trying to explain it to people who heard of graphic novels and don't quite get what it's all about.
It's even after all this time, with it having been the word for book length comics for a while, I still get a lot of people, or my wife especially, when she talks to her family and friends and say that I have a graphic novel coming out, the first thing they assume is that it's erotic, I think, or heavily violent or something in that degree, and she has to explain that it's no, it's a comic. It's a long form comic.
Mm-hmm. He goes into that idea of what to call it in some detail. There's a section early on where he's talking about the finite crisis of comics, how to read and discuss comics now that they're very different from what they used to be, and that thing with the title is, or not the title, but what to call them is one part of that.
He made a very good point in there that I thought was really interesting, which is that a lot of people complain because comics aren't inherently funny, that they were called comics because they were, amusing drawings. but he points out, and I think points out well, that novels were originally called novels because of their, I guess, novelty, their uniqueness. I didn't mean for that novelty pun to be there, but it sort of is in that vein, that they were this new form of entertainment that could be printed en masse and given out, but that even though that newness has long since dissipated, there doesn't seem to be any need on the part of novelists to try and redefine their art form in order to better, I guess, in order to better justify themselves artistically.
Yeah, well, when you name something, you have to name it in relation to something else. Often, how else are you going to come up with a word for it? I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, he also talks about how comics have sort of a Rodney Dangerfield attitude, the feeling like nobody respects the medium, and we have to kind of defend it by giving it a kind of more elite-sounding name or something. And also, he talks about how the terminology of describing what happens in comics often sort of implies that it aspires to be some other medium like movies or novels, where we talk about like a cinematic panel or something.
And I think that a big part of that is just that we have not yet defined a as much of a critical language in regards to comics as these other mediums have. We've developed an artistic language where we can talk about it, how the technical aspects, the panels, the gutters, all of the nitty gritty technical stuff, and to some of the other things like tangents and how to describe them from an artist standpoint in terms of how to do them and how to understand what you're doing. But there isn't really as much critical work that to base that on. There's been film studies, for decades and decades and decades, to the point that they have developed a language that is capable of describing it. And I think that this book, and what I hope with this book is that it will sort of begin this comic scholarship that will help people read and understand and better appreciate comics in the way that film has been done, and not in the way that art has that gallery art has been approached. I think that like everybody else, I think the critics ruin gallery art, and so but I do think that there is a need for criticism in an art form, and I think that it can only help to make that art form stronger.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of comics as something worthwhile of critical review is a very new idea.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just in its infancy. I wasn't sure what to make of his point that art comics often try to be ugly in their art style.
I think, and we've actually had a lot of debate about that at the school, because we had... there were two very different interpretations of that. There was my take, and then there was a graduate student's take, who wants a very idiosyncratic style and was sort of taking that to mean that the line quality and work should be ugly. And the way that I took it personally is, I think it has more to do with the subject matter and the discourse, the way that the telling happens, than the actual art style. I mean, the work done by Chris Ware, especially Charles Burns, his raw stuff like El Borba and Big Baby, it's beautifully drawn. It's the subject matter and the way that it's shown that is so, I guess, ugly, for lack of a better word, so unappealing. The hate stuff, the Dan Clowes stuff. Dan Clowes is a master craftsman, but he makes all of his characters as ugly as possible. And I think it has more to do with the subject matter than the actual craft employed. And what were your thoughts about that? Do you disagree with his stance on that, or?
Well, yeah, I think you may be right that it's just that the the stories that often are told in art comics, as opposed to mainstream superhero comics, tend to sometimes be kind of off-putting or whatever in their... Well, like you mentioned Charles Burns. I read Black Hole a while back, and I mean, some of the stuff in there is kind of, weird.
Yeah.
the mouth on the guy's neck and whatever. But I mean, he's a good artist, and I think that he could draw something that is visually appealing. But yeah, I think you're right. In that story, I mean, visually appealing isn't what he's necessarily going for.
And a lot of it might also, I think a lot of it has to do with the time. When I think of art comics, I don't really think as much of art comics being made today. I think about indie comics, but before indie comics, there were alternative comics for me, and before that, there were art comics, and I think of them as very different. I think of the indie comics now as being aesthetically indie, as opposed to more in regards to their subject matter. I think that, and he touches on this here. I think that ugliness in the art comics was a purposeful attempt to try and distance those comics from the mass-produced comics that were up until that point being employed. And it's the same way that comics in the late 80s, the superhero comics, Dark Knight Returns, things like that, tried to distance themselves so much from the childlike scope, to the point that it was just completely divorced from it. And I think that, and I may be optimistic about this, but I don't think that those battles really need to be fought as much anymore. These comics are my own voice style arguments, and I think as a result of that, you're seeing a lot of comics that are just taken for granted that you can do your own style, and so you're seeing a lot of, I guess you would think of them more as almost pop comics. Different variations, romantic comedy, it runs across the board, but done in sort of an art comic style, because that's been done. I think that early ugliness was simply to try and force a split, to try and force an acknowledgement.
Yeah, I guess that's the point I wasn't so sure of. I was wondering if it was just that they were drawing in their own styles and it was different. Whereas in a superhero comic, there's traditionally been more of a house style that everybody had to conform to, and just by not conforming to that, you come up with something, different from that. Not necessarily ugly, but definitely different from that.
Yeah. I think that what he is arguing, and I think that there is some validity to it, is that that there is an attempt by these especially 60s and 70s cartoonists to try and create a noticeably new thing, and in order to do that, it's very reactionary in that it's not so much trying to do something new as it is trying to break with something old. And I think that's part of where the ugliness comes in. There are a lot of comics that are generally ugly, and it always upsets me when I see those. I like to see there to be, some level of craft and some level of intent. Even I can take, some very abstracted forms and very loose work, but when somebody intentionally sets out to make their work as unappealing as possible, it becomes unappealing to me. And I think, and part of what Wolk argues here is that that's the point, that they're trying to make it difficult for people to like it, and therefore, if they like it, they must be in the know, kind of.
But I guess there are different kinds of ugly too. There's an ugly that takes a long time to draw, and then there's a really sloppy ugly, too.
I tend to lean against the sloppy ugly. The ugly that takes a long time to draw, a lot of times I'm more forgiving of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what's the guy's name? We read Clumsy. We reviewed Clumsy on this show.
Jeffrey Brown.
Yeah, Jeffrey Brown. I mean, to me, that art style is sloppier than maybe it needed to be.
It is. It's intentionally ugly, and I think that one of the things with Brown is that it is sort of an obvious, or not an obvious, it is a purposeful choice on his part. You can tell by a lot of, in his early work especially, you can tell by a lot of his compositions that he does have, a very keen storytelling eye. And I think with Jeff, one of the problems is just that he sort of hit indie superstardom fast because his style doesn't take a long time to draw. He started drawing in the same style, but without putting the same amount of time or emphasis on storytelling. And so, or on storytelling, on picking the shots and things like that. He has the capacity to do, I think, some really good stuff, and he has a few books that I just love. But I think that he does more than his than time permits, and I think that roughness sometimes can be a hindrance to his stuff. I'm more a fan of his comedy than his autobio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I Clumsy was okay, but
I haven't actually read that one. I read a couple of his shorter autobio ones, and they didn't really they weren't my cup of tea. And so I although I do, like I said, I do like his comedy stuff, his Amazing Change Bots and Big Hit. I haven't bothered picking up any of his other autobio stuff simply because I know it's not really in my vein of reading.
What was the point I was going to make?
We were talking about the ugly comics.
But Wolk also talks about how, in comparison to some media where there's sort of like movements and everyone does art in the art in a certain similar way, he says art comics are distinguished by their uniqueness from each other. Like each person is doing their own style, and that sort of constitutes a movement in comics.
I think that it did a while back, like in the 80s with Raw and things like that. But I think that now you definitely see sort of schools of not schools in terms of academic centers, although you do see styles coming out of those. But you definitely, there was definitely sort of a top shelf house style for a little bit, where you had a similar feel when you had Aaron Rainier and James Kachalka and Craig Thompson and Jeremy Tinder and Lily Curie all putting out books at the same time, and they all sort of felt the same. Mm-hmm. And you get that sort of cyclical what's popular feel every once in a while, and I think you do see a lot of similarities in places like Center for Cartoon Studies. A lot of their stuff, while it's unique, it has that Center for Cartoon Studies feel. There's a Savannah feel that guys like John Chad and Drew Wing and Eleanor Davis and Chris Wright all sort of have. Chris Wright to less of a degree, but Fallon Cook, they have those little dot eyes and that sort of like tiny little bit of hatching around the edges of stuff, and it's just, I think it just comes from being in the proximity of other artists, sort of in that boiling pot sense, and you get the Chicago artists and you get the Portland artists, and so I do think that there are sort of regional schools the same way that there are with other media, but I do think there, like Walk says, there's an active attempt to try and be as different as possible.
The book overall, what kind of person do you feel like it's aimed at? It felt kind of academic to me at times, where he'll use like Latin or French terminology. It starts to feel kind of academic.
And yeah, I agree with that. I'm actually going to be using this as a textbook for a survey of sequential art class, basically a comics history class. Because for one, there isn't really a great comic history book out there, and I think that the first half of this book really would do a good job of this in conjunction with understanding comics. Sort of gives a good review of how to work. So I would see it as being definitely academic, more of a classroom book, or for somebody who is sort of an aficionado of the reading side of comics, somebody who picks them up for the stories as opposed to for the art, and basically wants to understand them better. I still personally will, when I'm reading a book, a lot of times I'll pick up the cliff notes. If I'm reading like somebody who's a little bit heavier, like Conrad or something like that, just because I want to be better able to appreciate it, and I know there's a chance that I might miss some of the underlying subtext. And I think that a book like this is sort of probably aimed at that same at somebody like me who wants to do that same thing for comics. I've got those companions to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that somebody put out that points out all the little Victorian tidbits in the backgrounds and where they come from. Just because that's the sort of thing that's really interesting to me. I feel like the more I understand where the artist is coming from, the better I'm able to enjoy the book in subsequent readings. And so I think that's probably where it's leaning, where the audience is leaning towards.
Well, maybe that's his point in having all those reviews in the last part of the book. Because as I was reading them, I was kind of saying, like, who is this for? I mean, it didn't feel like it was for someone who... I don't know. It was. I mean, usually when I think of a review as being like a recommendation or saying like you should read this or you don't bother reading that but it didn't quite feel like that was what the reviews were there for, and so then I wasn't quite sure who he was writing them for exactly.
Yeah, the review side, I think that what he's trying to do, what I felt after reading this was sort of the motive of this book, was basically to try and start a scholarly movement, to say, to actually approach them really critically and determine what's good and what's bad. And I think for comics, more so than film, more so than art, more so than literature, it's such a small industry, and everybody is interrelated with everybody else, and grudges are often held. You can tick off the wrong person and get a whole chunk of people mad at you, and I think that is probably one of the reasons why we don't see more like really critical review of a lot of sort of the luminaries of comics, unless they're well in the ground. You get so many people who are so heavily influenced by artists like Kirby and Eisner or Kurtzman, and basically to say that not everything they touched was gold is almost like a slap in the face to a lot of people. And I think that what he's trying to do with this is to sort of de-holyize, if that could be considered a word, a lot of books that are held to this standard of either artistic achievement or of fame. There's a lot of books in here who are like that are famous or amongst comic people, or are thought of as sort of like the preeminent graphic novel. I mean, he's got Maus in there, he's got Watchmen, he's got Dark Knight Returns, he's got Blankets. It's sort of he's really got a lot of the ones that really, I guess, make the front page in terms of headlines about them as comics. And so I think what he seems to be wanting to do is to try and open a scholarly discussion that's where it's approaching it simply on the merit of its work and not on, such and such is a nice guy, but I don't necessarily like this. The sort of the pass off that I did with Jeffrey Brown's books. Like I will rarely, if ever, say anything like actively bad about another cartoonist's work, simply because unless I just feel like they're purposefully not trying or lessening the medium, and that's because I know that these are people that I'll probably run into, and I don't want to do that. And I think that most most people in the comic industry, even people who are doing stuff with Comics Journal, like Gary Groth, they still have to, the next day they've got to see these people or talk to them or something. And so I think that he's trying to make it to where there's more actual critical discussion and saying, is Contract with God, infallible? Is Watchmen infallible? And forcing that discussion. And whether or not I agree with his reviews, I do like that he took that approach with it, because there's a lot of stuff out there that I know that I personally, well, I'll talk to my friends and immediate colleagues about it, I would never publicly claim has as many flaws as it might, just because I don't want the stigma of being somebody who, because I'm a working artist, especially since my stuff may not be nearly as good as, artist A, if I critique artist A honestly, there's a chance that it'll be looked at as me thinking that I'm better than that artist, which is not necessarily the case. It's trying to think about it critically, and I think I'm rambling with this, but I think that's what he's trying to approach with these reviews.
The thing that bothered me the most in the review section was, and this is what I mentioned on the podcast a couple months ago. There were a couple of things that he said that that shook my confidence in his analytical, in his kind of how he was looking at the thing. Well, one was when he talks about Watchmen, he claims that the way the story comes out necessitates Rorschach having made a copy of his diary, and I do not know where he gets that idea. I don't
remember that one. It's been a while since I've read Watchmen, and I don't remember there being that in there.
No, well, I looked back at it, and we talked about that podcast. Actually, we were talking about Watchmen on the show, and it was obvious to me what happened with he mailed the diary, and it went to the newspaper, and it was sitting there in their slush pile, and I don't know where Wolk gets that he had to have made a duplicate of his diary. And another thing was in the Hope Larson chapter, he shows a page out of Gray Horses, and then he also describes the page. And the second panel of that page shows some lemon wedges on a plate, and he says that they're half-eaten cookies. And it's pretty obvious to me that they're lemon wedges, and in fact, in the next panel, the woman is making lemonade syrup. So
I'm looking for that one now, but yeah.
It's page 215.
Okay, yeah, I see it.
It's kind of the same thing as, when you hear a news report about something that you're familiar with and you see how they get it wrong, then you kind of start to doubt whether the news is getting anything right. And it's kind of the same thing here, where I start to wonder, well, these other things that I don't know as much about, is he missing something in those as well?
That is something. There were some of them where I thought, and this is always going to be the case, I think, with any criticism, is whether or not he's reading too much into particular things as to the intent of the creator in question. I find myself doing that, like watching a movie and thinking, oh, this is supposed to be, and I'll see things and they work incredibly well for whatever my supposition is, and so therefore I'll automatically assume that it was intentional, when I think that sometimes it's not, and that's where those cliff notes sometimes do you awry, is in suggesting that this is sort of an underlying theme of the book when it may not have ever intentionally been so. And so that's one of the things that I was wondering. I assume with people such as Alan Moore that they have every inch of idea mapped out to the 42nd decimal point, but with some of the other ones, I forget, it might be Grant Morrison, I forget which reviews I'm thinking of, but he he approaches them in a way that gives the artist a great deal of credit for intent, and and it might be Tomb of Dracula, like talking about the sort of the lack of anchors for the eye to rest, which on one hand may very well be the case. It might simply be intuitive on the part of the artist. It might be, but he did say that in some of his other artwork that wasn't the case. So it might have been an intentional part on the part of the artist. But that's something that I'm always curious about with any sort of criticism, is whether or not the critic not having intimate working knowledge of the artist's intent or methods, whether or not he's able to make those suppositions.
Yeah, they say, like, this is what this artist is trying to do, and it may not necessarily be that.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to discuss here, at the bottom of page 92, he says, superhero cartoonists can present narratives whose images and incidents are unlike our own sensory experience of the world, and totally cool looking, but can still be understood as a metaphorical representation of our world. That's something that's very easy to do in comics and very hard to do in any other medium. It's not the only thing that comics do well or what comics do best, but it's something that can be pulled off easily only in comics. I wasn't sure. I mean, I was wondering why is he saying that that's easier in comics than even like in film? I think it has to do with the sort of the distance from reality that comics have. As you start to get more simplified, I mean, think down to say like Peanuts or something. You know, the Peanuts cast could do pretty much just about anything, and as they never do, they're a very poor example. But Calvin and Hobbes, you know, it's granted it's imaginary, but when Calvin is interacting with dinosaurs or flying a jet or something like that, it doesn't feel remotely out of place. And I think a big part of that is the sort of the simplicity of line and the iconography of the cartoon makes it to where we as viewers are able to look at it as one sort of cohesive unit. You know, if you're drawing, you can draw a person next to a 400-foot monster, and there's going to be no difference in the discourse. Your person is going to look right next to that 400-foot monster. The same thing if you put him underwater, same thing if you put him in space, same thing if the buildings are walking around. Everything being drawn the same is going to be able to read clearly, and not having to have the movement and that correctness of movement of that monster or of this car makes it where that's incredibly easy to do in relation to film, where it requires, you know, hundreds of artists and extras and CG craftsmen and monster designers and everything else to try and make it look remotely correct. Well, what about animation, though? I mean, that's a different medium than comics.
It is, and I think that animation, again, it has to do with movement. It's this it's being able to do these individual frames. You know, you can, and I'm sort of stretching and trying to play devil's advocate here, but yeah, animation and comics are so very closely related, at least to me, and one of the things that I think distances them is that necessity of movement. With animation, it does sometimes become a little less likely if something happens. You know, you watch Spider-Man in a cartoon, and you know, subsequent to the movie where they sort of got his swinging right, it always felt very strange. You can see somebody, you know, punching somebody else or breaking their bonds, and for a very long time animation was unable to really capture that same sense without it feeling sort of silly and trivial. I think the Batman animated series did a great job of I guess making it work. But prior to that, most comics with superheroes in them, it always sort of seemed stiff and rigid, and there wasn't that fluidity that you had in the comics. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just trying to take these over the top simplified forms and making them work. But yeah, animation can do it. I disagree with him on that one, because I think that a lot of going from the comedy side, like Futurama, all the way over to, again, like Batman animated series on the action side, or things like Samurai Jack, you really can get that same sort of moment, like a highlight of a moment and a real sense of what's going on. So I do disagree with him on that, but I'd have to think about it for a long time to really figure out why.
Okay. Because
it's a good argument. Like almost every sentence in here, and this is, I think probably this is the mark of a good nonfiction book. Every sentence in here gets me questioning: do I agree with that or not? Mm-hmm. And so I think that the book is very good in terms of probably starting discussion. I think this would be an excellent book club thing if you have a bunch of people who all like comics, picking it apart and arguing with each other and arguing with Walk's suppositions that he makes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any final points you'd like to make?
I think let me see. There were a couple of things in here. The main thing was just I was so pleased to have sort of a good reason for the continuity stuff. The art comics, I think a lot of this is stuff that were we to think about and were we to talk about, we could probably come to our own conclusions that would be similar. But it's nice having things that I think articulated and giving reasons, which a lot of the stuff in here, from the part about auteurs to some of the, and I disagree with a lot of his reviews in terms of he thinks things are good that I think are bad, and some things that I think are good he thinks are bad. So there's definitely an active distance there, but I think that I'm really glad for this book's existence, simply because I do think that it sets out to be and succeeds at being a real sort of scholarly, critical approach to comics, sort of in a vacuum, like trying to examine them as they are and their worth as comics, using only comics as their basis of worth, not comparing them to film, not comparing them to literature, but comparing them to each other and talking about their strengths and weaknesses as a visual storytelling medium and as a tool of entertainment. And so I really like this book simply because of what it tries to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff I disagree with, but I'm enjoying disagreeing with it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on and discussing this, and I'll try to get a hold of your book.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I don't know when it's going to be available in Japan. I think it's
well, I get a lot of stuff
hopefully
from
sometime soon. Okay, well, yeah. I mean, if you ordered it from Amazon or anything, it should have already shipped. So It's just that long boat ride.
Mm-hmm. It's an outrage, the fine comics podcast programming we put out for you week in and week out, and still there are so few of you. Are you scandalized yet? If so, help us spread the word about deconstructing comics. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your pets. We're not picky. And besides, at this rate, there are sure to be iPods for dogs any day now, and most likely you've been saying all along that this podcast is for the dogs, so tell them too. You can also help us by posting a review of this podcast on iTunes. We'd also appreciate your feedback. What would you like us to talk about? Who would you like us to interview? Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. And if you think our interviews, reviews, and general comics-related discussion is worth some cold hard cash to you, feel free to send us some. Use the PayPal link at deconstructingcomics.com. And, yeah, we changed our theme, so sue me. Thanks again to Chris Schweizer for coming on the show. His book, Krogan's Vengeance, published by Oni Press, is on sale now. Deconstructing Comics is brought to you by ComicsNow.com. Subscribe to all your favorite series from Comics Now and get 35% off the cover price, and off of any other books you order. Comics Now provides many of the comics we review on this show. Read Eric's newsletter on our site, deconstructingcomics.com, to see this month's pick, which will be 50% off to Comics Now subscribers. Next week, in case you thought the podcast was getting too highbrow, it's a total Marvel geek out with our friend Patrick W. We'll talk about Secret Invasion, Cable, Spider-Man, and more, so come back for some wallowing in the mainstream next week. Till then, thanks so much for listening. This is Tim. See you next week on Deconstructing Comics.